Good morning, faithful listeners. I am very excited to get into today's story. We're going to be finishing up 2 Kings chapter 6 and talking about this crazy event that takes place in Israel's history. So stay tuned for a very sad and exciting story. So guys, the new Lion of Judah tea is here. It is not up on my website yet, but it is here and I am very excited about it. I got brand new sizes for everybody. Before, I used to only go up from extra small to 2XL. But now with these new teas, I have 3XL and 4XL as well. So I'm really excited to offer these new sizes to everybody and this brand new t-shirt that honestly looks fantastic. I think it looks better than the old style Lion of Judah tea that I had before. Now, my husband doesn't think so. He likes the old style better. So you have to take a look. Once I get these t-shirts up on the website, I'll let you guys know. And you tell me, do you like the old style Lion of Judah tea better or the new style? Regardless, the old style is still, well, some of them are still in stock and you can still purchase them if your size is in stock. But I highly recommend checking out the new Lion of Judah tea and maybe grabbing one for yourself or for a friend or for a family member because the tea looks great on everybody, man or woman. But speaking of tea, I've got my cup of tea right here with me, and mine right now is a ginger tea, a ginger lemon tea that I've been enjoying recently. But I did have a cup of coffee today. I did, and it did not bother me. So I'm extremely excited about that, and we'll have to see how that goes. But please go ahead and grab your cup of coffee or your cup of tea this morning and share it with me as we discuss 2 Kings chapter 6 and talk about verses 18 through 33. As I usually do, I'll be reading from the WEB. When they came down to him, Elisha prayed to Yahweh and said, "Please strike this people with blindness." He struck them with blindness according to Elisha's word. Elisha said to them, "This is not the way, neither is this the city. Follow me and I will bring you to the man whom you seek." He led them to Samaria. When they had come into Samaria, Elisha said, "Yahweh, open these men's eyes, that they may see." Yahweh opened their eyes, and they saw, and behold, they were in the middle of Samaria. The king of Israel said to Elisha when he saw them, "My father, shall I strike them? Shall I strike them?" He answered, "You shall not strike them. Would you strike those whom you have taken captive with your sword and with your bow? Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink and then go to their master." He prepared a great feast for them. After they ate and drank, he sent them away and they went to their master. So the bands of Syria stopped raiding the land of Israel. After this, Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, gathered all his army and went up and besieged Samaria. There was a great famine in Samaria. Behold, they besieged it until a donkey's head was sold for 80 pieces of silver, and the fourth part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 pieces of silver. As the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, a woman cried to him, saying, "Help me, my lord, O king." He said, "If Yahweh doesn't help you, where could I get help for you? From the threshing floor or from the winepress?" Then the king asked her, "What is your problem?" She answered, "This woman said to me, 'Give me your son, that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow.' So we boiled my son and ate him, and I said to her on the next day, 'Give up your son that we may eat him,' and she has hidden her son." When the king heard the words of the woman, he tore his clothes. Now he was passing by on the wall, and the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth underneath on his body. Then he said, "God do so to me and more also, if the head of Elisha the son of Shaphat stays on him today." But Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. Then the king sent a man from before him, but before the messenger came to him, he said to the elders, "Do you see how this son of a murderer has sent to take away my head? Behold, when the messenger comes, shut the door, and hold the door shut against him. Isn't the sound of his master's feet behind him?" While he was still talking with them, behold, the messenger came down to him. Then he said, "Behold, this evil is from Yahweh. Why should I wait for Yahweh any longer?" We kind of started today's portion in the middle of a story, so forgive me for that. I could have possibly broken this up better than I did. But you'll remember where we left off last time. The Israelites were having a lot of issues with Syria, as they always were, because Syria and Israel were constantly battling it out with each other. Just didn't like each other. So the Syrian king kept doing all of these secret movements against Israel. But what ended up happening was Elisha, who was getting prophecies from God, kept relaying the secret plans of the king of Syria to the king of Israel. So the Israelites were completely avoiding the Syrians and were able to not get caught in any of these attacks. And this makes the king of Syria super frustrated because he's like, how are the Israelites constantly evading my attacks? There must be a traitor among my council members. But the council members were like, no, there's a guy named Elisha who is a prophet in Israel who is telling the king of Israel all of our plans. In fact, he is so knowledgeable that he even knows what you are saying in your bedroom, O king. And so the king decides he's going to kill Elisha. So he sends a huge Syrian army out to get Elisha, and they completely surround the city of Dothan, which was where Elisha was staying. But Elisha also had a secret of his own that nobody else could see. There was a band of angels surrounding Elisha. And so Elisha could see all of these chariots of fire, these angelic chariots that were ready to protect him. And so Elisha had no fear. And so he prayed that the eyes of his servant would be opened so that his servant could also see all of these chariots of fire. And so God answered that prayer and opened the mind and the eyes of that servant that was with Elisha. But then right after this, after praying that somebody's eyes would be opened, Elisha now prays for somebody's eyes to be blinded. It says the Syrian army started advancing towards Elisha. And so Elisha prayed to Yahweh and said, please strike this people with blindness. And so God listened to Elisha and struck all of the Syrian army with blindness. And we don't know what type of blindness this is. I think most people assume that it was the blindness of the eyes, where the Syrians couldn't see anymore, like everything to them was just dark or blurry or something, which would obviously make them descend into complete chaos, because one minute they can see and then the next minute they're blind, or everything's blurry, they can't see anything. So that would be a really horrifying experience for all of those Syrian men. But it could also be that their minds were blinded, meaning that suddenly they are in confusion over who they are supposed to be capturing. One minute they knew where Elisha was, and the next minute they're suddenly super confused and their minds are blinded. And actually, if you read the works of Josephus, he's more in that camp. He believes that the minds of the Syrians were blinded, and that caused them once again to fall into chaos because they didn't know what they were doing. Or it could be a little bit of both. Maybe their eyes just weren't working properly, and also their minds were blinded as well. Because Elisha then is able to go up to one of the Syrian commanders and talk to him. And so Elisha's like, hey, the man you're looking for isn't in the city. In fact, you're in the completely wrong city. You should be over here, and let me show you which way to go. Here, I'll guide you to where you're supposed to be so you can find this man you're looking for. And the Syrian army goes with him. And you might be like, well, why did the Syrians go with him? Why did they trust him? Well, because they were thrown into complete chaos, and somebody is offering to help them and guide them when one moment ago they could see, and the next moment they have no clue what they're doing. And so somebody kind came up to them claiming to have the answers for them, and they didn't have anything else to do. They couldn't go back home. They couldn't see to capture Elisha, and they had no clue where Elisha even was at this point. So they trust the man in front of them who claims to have the answers. And so it says that Elisha led them into Samaria, which was the capital city of Israel and where the king lived. It says, when they had come into Samaria, Elisha said, Yahweh, open the men's eyes so that they may see. And God once again listens to the prayer of Elisha. And all of these men are in the city of Samaria, completely surrounded by Israelite soldiers. And suddenly they can see and understand what happened once again. And they're probably terrified. They're probably like, this is the last of our lives. This is the end. And that's what the king of Israel was thinking too. because he asks for Elisha's opinion. He says, "My father, Elisha, shall I strike them? Shall I strike them?" Like really excited. Like, let's go. Let's kill all these Syrians. And Elisha says, "No, you shall not strike them. Would you strike those whom you have taken captive with your sword and with your bow?" He says, "Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink, and then go to their master." So Elisha challenges the king to show kindness to these Syrians because they were prisoners of war. And because they hadn't killed anybody, they weren't doing anything particularly damaging. They didn't damage the countryside or anything like that. They really were only coming to get Elisha by the king's word. And so Elisha, in a sense, was the one showing this kindness to these Syrians because the Syrians had come to kill him. And so now he's going to show them a blessing in return. But the king of Israel actually does listen to Elisha. And so he sets food in front of them and actually says he prepared a great feast for them. And after they ate and drank, he sent them away and they went to their master. And it says, so at that moment, the bands of Syria stopped raiding the land of Israel. Meaning word of this got around in Syria. And so these bands of Syrians who would come in and secretly raid Israel and capture people and kill people, all of that stopped because of the rumors going around that Elisha and the king of Israel had been kind to the Syrians. This also caused the king of Syria to stop doing these secret little meetings as well, because he knew that they weren't going to work. So what does he do? It says the king of Syria, his name being Ben-Hadad, decides to just wage an all-out war. No longer secretive, no longer sending out bands of raiders to try to kill people. He's like, no, you know what? I'm just going to wage an all-out war against Israel because that's the way it's going to work here. And once again, if you read the works of Josephus, the historian who talks about this story, he actually says that the Syrian king ended up having a kind of respect and fear of Elisha, that he decided not to be secretive anymore and just thought it would be better to wage an all-out war against Israel. But I don't know if that's really true or not because scripture doesn't say that. But whatever happened, the Syrian king's mind and heart was not changed towards Israel. Even though at this point in time, he has heard of Elisha, most likely on several occasions, because if this story happened after Naaman the leper, who was one of the Syrian king's best commanders, he would have heard about how Naaman was healed by Elisha as well. And then not to mention this miracle that just took place and the miracle of Elisha telling the king all of the Syrian secrets. So this king of Syria knew who Elisha was, knew that there was a powerful prophet in Israel who worshiped Yahweh. And yet this king, Ben-Hadad, unfortunately did not care about Yahweh. So he goes against Samaria. He besieges Samaria. And this was a very common tactic that people would do back in these days. An army would besiege a city to make all of the people inside unable to get out. They wouldn't directly attack the city, but they would force everybody inside the city. Nobody would be allowed to leave. And so the people inside the city would eventually starve to death. And there'd be so much disease and death and starvation and thirst that the people would get demoralized. And at that point, they'd be too weak to do anything. And the Syrians could come in and just completely destroy the city. This was a very common tactic. And a lot of times, sieges would last for months to years, possibly. So it says that they took the city of Samaria, and it says there was a great famine in Samaria, and behold, they besieged it until a donkey's head was sold for 80 pieces of silver, and the fourth part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 pieces of silver. And most likely here, dove's dung is not referring to like actual bird droppings. It was probably the name of either a bean in the area, like a carob bean of some sort, or of an herb or a vegetable that might have looked like dove droppings or something like that. I don't know. But regardless, food became so scarce that like the junk food, like the head of a donkey with almost like no meat on it, would be sold for, what does it say, 80 pieces of silver. And then these like beans, these dove droppings, whatever they were, a pint of them were sold for 5 pieces of silver. And silver at this point in time was not common like it was in the days of Solomon. 5 pieces of silver was about a month's wage during these days. Meaning that if you wanted just a pint of beans, which what would that feed your family for a couple days? It would cost you a month's wage. That is how scarce food was. And the people started turning cannibalistic in Samaria because of this. And you might be like, where's the king of Israel? Oh, he was there. He was stuck in the city the same as everybody else. But of course, because he's the king, he gets the first share of all of the food. And he apparently, according to, once again, Josephus, would walk around the city wall, because a lot of times the cities would have these walls and you would be able to walk on top of them. And so the king would walk around these walls looking at the inside of the city to make sure that there weren't any Syrian traders inside the city ready to give up the entire city to Syria. So he was constantly checking the inside of the city by walking its perimeter day after day. But the king's problem was that he was fearful of the Syrians and practically abandoned the city of Samaria to the Syrians because he was scared to confront them. He did not think that he had enough power to do it, which is very sad because God has shown his power to Jehoram several times, and yet Jehoram was terrified of the Syrians. Even though not too long before this, he actually saw the Syrians blinded coming into the city of Samaria, all due to God's amazing power. But Jehoram likely did not have enough faith in Yahweh. And actually, none of Israel did at this time as well. It says in verse 26 that King Jehoram of Israel was passing by on the wall, and a woman cried up to him, saying, "Help, my lord, O king." And he looks down at the woman, and he sees her in her distress, and he thinks she's going to ask for food. And he says, "If Yahweh doesn't help you, where could I get help for you? From the threshing floor or from the winepress?" And the king asked her, "What's your problem?" So he's having very little patience with this woman because he believes she's going to ask him for some sort of food. And he's like, "There is no food to give you. We're all suffering here," which I doubt the king was suffering as much as the people. I'm sure he definitely lost some weight, but I doubt that he was suffering the same way that these people were. So he asks the woman, "What is your problem?" And she says, "Well, this woman said to me, 'Give your son that we may eat him today, and then we will eat my son tomorrow.' So we boiled my son and ate him. And I said to her on the next day, 'Give up your son that we may eat him.' And she has hidden her son." And the king hears this, and he is distraught because his people in Samaria have resorted to cannibalism and eating their own children. He tore his clothes when he heard what the woman said. And he didn't help her either. He didn't force the other woman to give up her son. The entire situation was awful. Just the fact that these two mothers thought it was okay to eat children in order to survive. But Deuteronomy 28, if you turn all the way back to the Old Testament law, talks about this. This is the very long chapter about the blessings and the cursings that Israel is going to experience depending on whether or not they follow the Old Testament laws. So God says in Deuteronomy 28, verse 45 to start, "All these curses will come on you and will pursue you and overtake you until you are destroyed because you didn't listen to Yahweh your God's voice to keep his commandments and his statutes which he commanded you." And obviously God gave the Old Testament law to the Israelites because it was the best possible way to live. And as people just completely abandoned God's way, things were going to get worse and worse as people got more and more lawless. And as people just started doing whatever they wanted to do and got more violent and less caring of other people. God says, if you keep my commandments, things will go well for you because these commandments are good. They're not here so that I can make you slaves. They're here because they're actually the best possible way to live your lives. But if you don't follow my commandments, bad things will happen to you. And so God goes on to explain the future in Deuteronomy 28, verse 52 through 57. He says, they will besiege you in all your gates until your high and fortified walls in which you trusted come down throughout all your land. They will besiege you in all your gates throughout all your land which Yahweh your God has given you. You will eat the fruit of your own body, the flesh of your sons and of your daughters, whom Yahweh your God has given you, in the siege and in the distress with which your enemies will distress you. The man who is tender among you and very delicate, his eye will be evil towards his brother, toward the wife whom he loves, toward the remnant of his children whom he has remaining, so that he will not give to any of them the flesh of his own children whom he will eat, because he has nothing left to him, in the siege and in the distress with which your enemy will distress you in all your gates. The tender and delicate woman among you, who would not venture to set the sole of her foot on the ground for delicateness and tenderness, her eye will be evil toward the husband that she loves, toward her son, toward her daughter, toward her young one, who comes out from between her feet, and toward her children whom she bears, for she will eat them secretly for lack of all things in the siege, and in the distress with which your enemy will distress you in your gates. And that is exactly what's happening here in 2 Kings 6 with this siege. God told the people this would happen if they got further and further away from the commands that he gave them and got more and more lawless and more unloving towards people. Eventually, people would start eating their own children rather than cry out to Yahweh to help this situation. Because when the king hears this woman's story, what's his first response here? He doesn't cry out to Yahweh. He decides he's going to kill Elisha. In verse 31, then the king said, God do so to me and more also if the head of Elisha the son of Shaphat stays on him today. That was the king's first response, not crying out to Yahweh. These people were so anti-Yahweh at this point, worshiping their own gods, just doing whatever their little hearts pleased them, that they would rather eat their own children than ask God for mercy and for help. It says Elisha was sitting in his house. And I don't know if he was in Samaria. It very well could have been. Maybe God was supplying food for Elisha and for the prophets and elders that were with him. I would imagine Elisha was in Samaria at this point because he did often go to Samaria. And also, I don't know how the king could have sent a messenger out to Elisha. If Elisha were in a different city, I don't think that would be possible with the siege. So I think Elisha was in Samaria during this point. It says Elisha was sitting in his house and the elders were sitting with him. Then the king sent a man from before him. But before the messenger came to him, Elisha said to the elders, do you see how this son of a murderer, meaning the king, has sent someone to take away my head? Behold, when this messenger comes, shut the door and hold the door shut against him. Isn't it the sound of his master's feet behind him? So Elisha knew, he prophesied, he had a vision or a message from God that the king of Israel, Jehoram, was sending a messenger to come and kill him. And Elisha gets angry. He's like, this son of a murderer is now going to become a murderer himself. It says, while he was still talking with the elders, behold, the messenger came down to him. And then at the very end, the king says, behold, this evil is from Yahweh. Why should I wait for Yahweh any longer? So the king finally admits who he's actually angry at. He's angry at Yahweh. He's angry that God did not do what he wanted him to do. He says, all of this evil in this city that happened is from Yahweh. And so why? Because this is all from Yahweh, why should I wait on Yahweh? What's the point of me praying to Yahweh any longer? Clearly, he does not do what I want him to do. And that is how this chapter ends, with this king questioning Yahweh, being so angry at Yahweh for what happened in his city. But unfortunately, as we know from Deuteronomy 28, all of this could have been avoided had the people and the king just worshipped Yahweh and followed the commands in the Old Testament that were just so good for the Israelite people. You know, on Friday, where I do a podcast episode for the members, we're going through Psalms right now. We talked about Psalm 27, and we discussed this very topic, actually, that God sends both good and bad to people. And that makes a lot of people very angry. You know, we just talked last week about God sending Paul a thorn in the flesh. We just talked about that. God sends both sunshine and rain to people. But you'll notice if you read through the book of Isaiah, it's a fantastic book. If you read through it, God's anger lasts for a moment, but his love lasts forever. And when he punishes people, he's never doing it because he just wants to kill people or send calamity, or because he is just a hyperbolic God that kills people willy-nilly. No, he does it to teach people a lesson. And what was the lesson here in 2 Kings 6? That the Israelite people had gone so off the path that leads to God that they were more willing to kill their own children and eat their own children and cannibalize themselves rather than cry out to God and ask for forgiveness and mercy and to supply food for the city and the means to be able to fight the Syrians here. That was the lesson. But in the next chapter, we're going to see how God completely flips the script and he comes to his people's aid. And within one day, everything in Samaria changes. The people go from starving to full. The people go from poor to practically rich. And we're going to talk about all of that in the next chapter on Wednesday. Well, faithful listeners, thank you so much for sharing a cup of tea with me this morning. I hope you all enjoyed 2 Kings chapter 6, but I'm really excited to talk about the next portion on Wednesday, 2 Kings 7, and we're going to see what God does to completely save Samaria at this point in time. But faithful listeners, I hope you have a fantastic and wonderful rest of your day. I'll see you guys tomorrow, bright and early, 6 a.m., or whenever you choose to wake up. Happy listening, and God bless.